I'm always on the lookout for new stuff to watch, and recently, YouTube recommended a channel called Cody Can't Eat This. This guy has created some impressive 3D remakes of classics like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Pokemon Red and Blue. He's also working on his own game, so check it out, link in the doobly-doo. This got me thinking, why not remake a bad game? 5 Unity tutorials later, I began what I figured would take a couple of weeks. 4 months of suffering later, and I've remade Hydlide in 3D, but before I tell you about that, what the fuck is Hydlide? And why does everyone hate it? Hydlide is not one of those games I played as a child, thank God. This is surprising because I bought most of my games at the flea market, and you'd think lots of people would have traded this one in. I first saw it on YouTube as an adult, and the content creators who reviewed it were not kind.
It's super short and can be beaten in a few hours, but for how brief it is, it was one of the most painful games I have ever played.
And that's what you get for reaching into the dark depths of the NES library. You might as well be reaching into a dog's asshole, because all you're gonna find is shit.
Hydlide was inspired by the Tower of Duraga and the Black Onyx, and was first released in Japan in 1984 for the NEC PC 6001 and PC 8801. It was actually really innovative when compared to the role-playing games of the time, and was well received. The next year, it was ported to 4 more computers, including the MSX and the MSX2. Back then, most games were similar to this 1983 Famicom port of the arcade game Donkey Kong or the original Mario Bros. They showed one screen at a time and were mostly about getting a high score. However, things in this industry move fast, and in 1985, Super Mario Bros. Made its Famicom debut. So, Hydlide was already a little stale when it hit the Famicom the next year in 1986. They did tack on a magic system, but it was otherwise just a port. Unfortunately for Hydlide, something else was released for the Famicom in 1986. Something magical. Zelda's NES debut beat Hydlide to market by 2 years. Hydlide was left mostly unaltered in its localization, and in a world with Zelda and Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest if you're nasty, this was never going to fly. The NES version of Hydlide, simply called Hydlide, was released in North America in 1989, a full 5 years after the original PC version, and by then this once innovative game was painfully outdated. I'm not judging Hydlide as an innovative PC release in Japan. I have to see it for what it is to me. An NES game that was painfully outdated before it was even released. It is a bad game, at least in this context. Imagine having years of feedback and a look at newer games like Zelda or Dragon Warrior and not using that to your advantage. Making improvements when releasing Japanese games into North America was common, but TNE Soft and FCI just chose not to. Hydlide was followed up by Hydlide 2 Shrine of Darkness and Hydlide 3 The Space Memories, which was ported to the Sega Genesis as Super Hydlide, a very Nintendo name for a Sega release, but you do you, TNE Soft. Finally, last and also least, Virtual Hydlide was a 1995 remake of the original Hydlide for the Sega Saturn, and oh no. No. I think that's all the context I can stand. Let's take a look at the actual game, and then remake Hydlide in 3D. And may God have mercy on my soul. Hydlide explains everything you need to know in the manual and in one single cutscene. Here it is, flashing light warning. You got that, right? There's a princess, her name is Anne. There's a dragon, and he turns her into 3 fairies. You are Jim the Knight. Yeah, you need to collect all 3 fairies and defeat Borealis or Borealis in the NES version. The game has very little in the way of animation. Defeated enemies just disappear and then instantly respawn entering from off-screen. In the late game, tougher enemies respawn instead. The game contains a handful of sound effects and 4 whole songs, each about 15 seconds long, but it mostly just loops the one theme over and over until you go insane. The music is different on Japanese PCs, but the Famicom and NES versions of the Hydlide theme sound really similar to the Indiana Jones theme. This, it seems, is Hydlide's legacy in North America, to be constantly accused of ripping off Zelda and Indiana Jones despite only being guilty of the latter. You don't get any experience points for enemy kills using magic, likely a result of the magic system being tacked onto the game for the Famicom port, and the whole game is extremely grindy. You need exactly 100 experience points for each level, curves hadn't been invented yet, and as you level up, easier enemies stop giving you experience. You'll need to kill 200 slimes to reach level 3 to really even get started, and then they stop giving you XP. To save money on a battery backup, the game has this weird hybrid of a save system and a password system, where you can save and load your last save, so long as you never turn the console off. If you're going to turn it off, then you need to choose password from the menu and write it down so it can be entered when you turn the console back on. Other reviews seem to be confused as to how this works.
Load? When would I ever want to load a game from within the game?
As long as you don't turn off the console after you die, you can go into a new game, select load, and load your last save. It's only when you turn the game off that you need the password. So, sorry AVGN, you wrote down and entered a lot of passwords for nothing. The screen shifting is jumpy and awkward and causes the music to speed up and slow down. You have an attack and defend mode that seems pointless and unintuitive. In attack mode you do more damage, but you also take more damage, and in defend mode it's the opposite. You can get an advantage by attacking enemies from behind, but I mean, where is the slime's behind? Don't answer that. Without the grinding, it's an incredibly short game. It really is less than what it sounds like. The moment-to-moment gameplay is basically just bumping into monsters and hoping you win. Why am I remaking this? Why doesn't someone come and stop me? For some strange reason, I decided to remake the entire game rather than just a vertical slice. Honestly, I bit off more than I could chew. So we'll save the dungeons, bosses, password, and save system and any improvements for a second video, assuming this one does well. Like and subscribe. Really, please. I need to justify this. It took so long. My first approach was to create a plane and apply an image of the game's map as a material. Then I would go around and place items on top of where they were painted on the plane. Then I could cut the plane into faces and apply different materials for each area. It did not take long for me to wonder if there was a faster way. Hydlide's map is totally flat, so I didn't need to worry about scaling any of the map up into 3D mountains or anything like that. With that in mind, I decided instead to go with a plugin from the Unity asset store called Jujube Map Editor. This plugin allows you to make custom cubes and stack them in a similar way to Minecraft. So I set about making a cube for each of the tiles in the game: grass, desert, forest, and so on, using screenshots of the game's original graphics. I was even able to add the little trees to the top of the forest cubes so that they would all neatly align. This is what the nearly finished map looks like. As you can see, I've begun placing the objects into the scene. I ended up placing about 1/4 of the trees by hand before I thought of making the forest cubes. Can I just take a second to point out that the game has 2 types of trees, but the ones in the actual forest are basically just bushes that don't even cover the top of Jim's head? Anyway, first I made sure all of the tree placements and spawn locations exactly matched the map. But toward the end I realized that the trees are slightly different in every port, and the spawn locations are actually random, and every copy of the map has them in different places. So I took some artistic license toward the end, but tried to stay true to the original. On the NES, each tile is broken down into 4 subtiles, and this could be seen clearly around the dirt tiles. Rather than make a bunch of new tiles to compensate for this, I just kept it as close to the original as possible with the tiles I had. After all, these two vary in every port. Next, it was time to deal with the looping of the map. In the game, the map loops on all sides, and I was able to make this work by teleporting Jim and the camera from one side to the other in the same place. The camera shakes a little, but that's nothing I can't fix. Then, to make it look like a continuous map, I made dummy copies of the map and placed them on all sides so that you can see in all directions. The idea being that the copies of the map are just for show and could be exported as a single mesh. I could then reduce the polygon count on the extra map pieces to save on resources since they were just for show. This all worked, but the problem was the map size. It's just too small. You see that desert? It's the same as this desert, and this desert, and this desert. You can see it in all directions. The original game doesn't have this problem. It only shows one screen at a time from a top-down perspective. This was not a compromise I was willing to allow in a 3D remake. So I decided that Fairyland was a floating island. I know I said improvements to the game were for the next video, but I hadn't decided that at this point, and this one seems kind of necessary. The only other option would be to make the map much bigger, and this project is big enough as it is. Now, doing this sort of breaks the map in some places. This bit of desert had to be moved move to the other side because when the map loops, it's all one big area. This area, where you fight the two wizards, is made up of two map edges, and there's no way to get to a few places, but these problems can be fixed by just moving things around a little. First, let's pretty up the island with some bricks for it to rest on, some edges that look nice, and waterfalls for the places where the rivers end. By this time, I had also added a custom skybox I made from Adobe stock photos, but we'll replace that with something more custom a little later on. You may have noticed already that under the island, I added a plane and textured it with our water material made from the game's original water tiles, and animated it using a free water shader just to make it look nice. You can also see here that I added a mountain just for fun, but I removed it later. Jim also now has his heads-up display. We'll talk about that in a bit. Oh yeah, did I mention I made Jim? Let's talk about the models.
Nice f***ing models!
I used a program called Magica Voxel. Voxels are basically models made of tiny cubes that mimic the look of pixelated graphics, but in 3D. My first attempt to make Jim the Knight was to recolor an existing model that comes with the program and then change it bit by bit from this Axe Warrior into Jim. It turned out well, but after somehow breaking the color palette, I decided to make a more literal translation of Jim based on his in-game sprite. In the game, Jim's little legs move up and down as he walks, so I attached a movement script from the Unity Asset Store and set the jump height to 0 since Jim can't jump. Then I added a quick script to cycle through 3 versions of the model using a tutorial on YouTube. I noticed that when Jim stops, it just keeps whatever model you happen to land on, often leaving him standing on one leg, but since he also does that in the original game, I just left it in. Dude likes to stand on one leg. Jim has no attack animations to speak of, but when he takes damage, he's replaced for a few frames with a red box. Rather than mimic this exactly, I made a new red color palette and updated my script to make Jim turn red for a few frames when damaged. And speaking of damage, this is where I had to make the first monster a slime. It did not go well. So I searched the internet for voxel slimes, took a look at some examples, and tried again. My next try was much better, and this is where I decided a couple of things. Since I'm making voxel versions of pixel art, I should lean into the rectangular boxy style, and it would be really cool if the slime could melt into the ground and reform. So I made a script for the enemies that, among other things, would both move them in random directions, much like in the original game, and cycle through a list of models to give each enemy a unique animation. In my next project, I want to learn Unity's built-in animation system, but for now, this will do. Now I had an enemy that could move. I adjusted the collision on both models, gave them variables for things like hit points, and set Jim as a trigger that would deal damage if they touched each other. I gave Jim a slight bit of knockback to make bumping into enemies feel better, and then implemented the attack and defend modes. I had no idea how much going into attack mode should increase damage given and taken, but for now, I took a guess and made it double. But it's easily adjusted here in the inspector window. So let's go back to the heads-up display for a second. It was easy enough to grab a plugin yet again from the Unity Asset Store and then remake it into a similar display as the one found in the original game. However, the amount of damage Jim or the monster should take is based on his current strength stat. It's easy enough to find lists of how many experience points he gets from killing each enemy. Those sources vary a little since it's hard to read the display in the original game precisely. And I know that every 100 XP Jim gains a level and his life, strength, and magic go up by 10 points, but knowing how those values are used to determine the damage he should do is another thing altogether. And that's not even dealing with the fact that there also seems to be some random chance that Jim or the monster will miss any given attack and do no damage, and that probably also changes as he levels up. So at this point, I called in some help. I reached out to the king of NES assembly and disassembly, Displaced Gamers. If you've never heard of his channel before, then I highly recommend it. He suggested that I reach out to the NES mod community because Hydlide modders would know the game better than anyone, and so that's exactly what I did. I emailed Whole Tone Games, who made a remarkable rebalance patch for Hydlide, making it way less grindy, and he replied with a lot of great information. I still ended up taking some educated guesses as to how exactly the stats should work, but the fact that this remake is even close to accurate is because of these guys, so thank you to both of them. I'm hoping that if we do a follow-up video, Whole Tone Games will be willing to help some more, but we'll see how this video does. Next, I finished and placed all of the objects in the game, so I'm just going to briefly mention each. You've seen the trees from the forest, or bushes anyway. Next is this ugly castle that needs to be redone. Hydlide has 3 of these on the world map. This is a model for all the treasure chests. The model in the game has a pink color, but it didn't look right, so I reimagined it, and all I can say is at least it turned out better than my reimagined castle. Sometimes the sprites just don't scale up in a way that's helpful for making models. I also had to write a script for the chest so that Jim could get an item, but we'll come back to that later. Next up are these posts, and I stuck to the original design here, though I did replace the blue color with gray since it just looked wrong to my eye. Then came the larger tree, which I think turned out pretty well. Much like the posts, I had to swap out the black in the bushes and trees for dark green, as the original palette just didn't look right in 3D. Next up we have this rock, which along with the tree model also doubles as an enemy. Finally, here's the tombstone from the graveyard. Originally I made this one square just like the original sprite, but having one side blank didn't look right, so I went with this style since it looks good from all directions. I also made all of the items for the game here, and I really stuck to the original design. I didn't really have to make these in 3D since they only appear in the menu, but I thought it would be cool if they were at least 1 block thick so that I could angle them in a way that would cast a shadow. You'll see what I mean when we make all of the menus. The items list also included all 3 fairies, but weirdly enough, the 3 fairies from the title screen are different from the 3 fairies in the game, so I ended up having to redo them. Last but not least, we have Princess Anne and the monsters Jim will face to save her. You've already seen our little slime guy from earlier when we got the battle system working. In the background here, you can also see that I've created many of the dungeons already, but due to time restraints, they're not all finished. This will eventually be the congratulations screen, and I also have both the lamp dungeon and the key dungeon basically complete. Moving on to the rest of the monsters, we have Ropers and Hypers, who have this weird mouth opening animation, Kobolds and Goblins, Sandworms and Eels, who do, well, this, and the Lady, Gold, and Black Armors, who are all basically the same model in different color palettes. Now, the zombie did not scale up well, so I made him into a Minecraft-style dude with a wicked mullet. Last, we have our skeleton, who appears to have a bum leg in the original game, and I couldn't help but keep it. Look at him. We also have 3 flying monsters, including the Will-o-wisps, poisonous wasps, which are not bees, and the vampire bats, which are shamelessly called sturges, a name that was straight copied from Dungeons & Dragons. We're nearly done with the models, I swear. We just have the bosses, including this wacky-looking vampire. This is exactly what he looks like in the original game. And the water dragon, who seems to look less like a dragon the bigger the sprite gets. So I just looked up some voxel dragons online and made mine similar to those examples. Then we have the 2 wizards you have to kill at the same time to get the 3rd fairy. Finally, we have Boralis, or Boralis, who I'm saving for a possible part 2, but he looks like this. With all that in place, I decided it was time to add logos, a start screen, and the password screen. The password screen doesn't do anything yet, but in the future, I'd like to add a real save system and just use this password system for cheat codes. I remade every text character in the game for this screen, and that was totally unnecessary, as this font called Pixel Emulator looks almost exactly like the original NES font. Oh well, live and learn. I did use the font in other places, so thank you to Neil Davidson of pixelsagas.com. These screens are based on the original, but slightly different. You can see how I used some of the flat 3D items here below the logo. I also added the opening cutscene to the start page. I did this by recording and editing it, and then playing the MP4 file on a plane, almost like a virtual TV being recorded by a virtual camera. Now I went through the game and added music ripped straight from the original game. Then I opened the ROM in an emulator, turned off the music, and recorded all of the sound effects I needed. I had an interesting problem when programming the treasure chest sound effect, since the chest disappears on the same frame the sound effect goes off. The object would be removed, and so the sound effect couldn't play. Rather than add the sound effect to a different object in the scene, I just teleported the chest far off screen while the sound effect played, and it was a fun little solution to figure out. Once the chests were working, I went back to Jim and added a list, which for those of you that are computer programmers works much like an array. I wrote code that would add the item in the chest to Jim's inventory, which is the list. Next, I had to add the first fairy randomly to one of these trees and spawn a random number of wasps when Jim touches them, or bees if you want to call them bees. I gave each tree a 10% chance of adding the fairy to Jim's inventory, and since Jim dies pretty easily in the early game, this seemed like a good time to add a game over screen. Normally when Jim dies, he does this spinning animation and then falls over. I decided instead to add a whole scene to this, and here's what that looks like. With all that finished, I just had a few small things left to do. I recreated the skybox using a photo of clouds and then pixelated them a bit to make it match the scene better. Next, I added the pause screen. Hydlide has both a menu and a pause screen, but I decided to combine both. By now, I was way out of time, so I added making the menu options work to my list of possible future improvements and moved on. I did, however, simulate the option of speeding up the game in another way. You can just hold the tab key during gameplay to run. I also added a custom cursor to the game that matched the look a little better. The last couple of things I needed to add to Jim's code were magic spells and the ability to heal. For magic, I just made the right mouse button cycle through the spells while the left button would cast the selected spell. I made it so that spells would not work unless Jim had the required number of magic points and then gave each spell its own properties. Fire is a one-shot kill but can't pass through any walls. Ice is basically the same thing but can go through walls, and Wave can go through more than one monster. I removed the requirement for Wave to only be fired left or right since it makes killing the wizards extremely tedious as they both have to be killed at once. Finally, Turn causes enemies to go in the opposite direction, allowing you to hit them from the back. What a brave knight. And then, maybe the most forward-looking of Hydlide's mechanics, Jim heals by standing perfectly still. Jujube Map Editor made this pretty easy. I just had to check and see if Jim was standing on a certain block, say grass, and heal him the correct amount slowly over time, or harm him as the case may be. The final adjustment I made was to also use the map tiles to check and see if each monster was in the correct area. Slimes appear in the grass, sandworms in the sand, kobolds in the forest, and so on. If they wander out of the area, they get teleported back to their original spawn point, and this worked nicely. Though, if I could make one improvement, I would add an animation so that slimes melt into the ground and reform at their spawn location, sandworms sink beneath the sand and travel back, kobolds disappear and reappear in a puff of magic, etc., so that it doesn't look like they just straight up disappear. Though straight up disappearing was good enough for the original game. Even with these spawn locations, I wanted to keep the randomness of spawning monsters from the original game, so I also made it that when monsters are killed, they randomly spawn somewhere near the player, much like in the original game. Game still looked a bit too barren for me though, so at the last minute I added some flowers and tufts of grass using a plugin called Prefab Painter, which allowed me to place them randomly, though I did go back and move many of them around. And with that, I was done for now. So in conclusion, I hate this game, but I really love making games. I think I want to make my own game, so is that something you guys would watch? In the short term, I'd like to make a part 2 where we actually improve the game with a real attack button and a town with actual NPCs and give hints. I also want to finish all the dungeons and make the game completable. But that is up to you. Share this video on Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook. Send it to friends and be sure to like and subscribe. This was a huge time commitment, and I'd love to do more, but for that to happen, this video has to do well. If you want to see me talk about another game, I have this video on Beyond Oasis. It's my only other gaming video for now, not counting live streams. You can also support me directly on patreon.com/fancygeeks with as little as $1 a month. Patrons got updates throughout this whole multi-month ordeal, and they got to watch this video before anyone else. Or go to Patreon, donate $1, and tell me to get back to comics and stop this nonsense. You know, if that's how you feel. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please be kind to each other. I'm Jay Parks.